Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Luke Shabro, who is a futurist, writer, TEDx speaker and coach, and a Navy veteran. He is also the Deputy Director of the U.S. Army Mad Scientist Initiative and Senior Futures Analyst. Luke and his colleagues engage and collaborate with academia, tech, industry, all military branches, the intelligence community, and government agencies to help envision and describe the future operational environment. Luke Shabro, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, thanks, Sean. I'm really excited to be here. Can't wait to talk to you.
Likewise. And before we get into this, I would just like to inform our audience that Luke's opinions are his own and do not represent the policy positions of the Army or the Department of Defense. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Luke, will cover the Mad Scientist Initiative. But before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your overall comment about our strategic landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can be a little bit of a trope, but I tend to roll it out anyways. I really feel like we are at an inflection point when it comes to the strategic environment. And what we're seeing is a world that is changing, which really I'll get into why that's kind of inspired the Army Mad Scientist Initiative to stand back up in 2015. But really, what I see is this growing bipolar world, because we've seen in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, China named as the pacing threat. When you really look at it, China drives most of the decisions being made right now, the policy being made, even the concept creation for how we plan to fight, compete, and win in future warfare, not only in warfare as well, though, but throughout competition too. And so we see China as that pacing threat, but we have an acute threat right now in what Russia is doing in Ukraine and the possible threat to NATO and our Western allies. Additionally, you still have threats from major competitors like Iran, North Korea, and still having to deal with violent extremist organizations and transnational criminal organizations. So an extremely complex operational environment. And strategically, we are finding ourselves in the biggest challenge we've had in the post-Cold War period.
Yeah, 100% on all that. Well, maybe we can start talking about the Mad Scientist Initiative. Could you give us the 101? When was it started? What's it about, et cetera?
Yeah, absolutely. We get asked all the time, are we all mad and all scientists? And the funny part of it is, I think we all might be a little mad, but not in the angry sense, just a little out there. Everybody on our team actually is not really engineers or scientists, but maybe scientists in the softest sense through political and social sciences. But the program originally started in the mid-2000s. So the G2 at that time, Maxie McFarland, was really looking at what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we were dealing with the IED problem across the DoD. And so there was this major push. We saw the up-armoring of vehicles and other technologies used for the counter-IED program. You saw the stand-up of organizations like JIATO, COIC, CITP, different organizations to try and tackle this massive problem that we had. And the question was, why was this a surprise? If we looked at history and we took a look at all the way back to the Vietnam War, what we would consider booby trapping and things like that at the time, all the way through the wars in former Yugoslavia, where you started seeing use of improvised explosive devices. Why was this such a surprise to us when we were dealing with these insurgents or terrorist organizations, violent non-state actors, and dealing with this? And so Maxie McFarland at that time said, how do we get outside of our own Army speak, our groupthink, our silos, and start thinking about these challenges and these next threats and get left a bang. And so the idea was with mad scientists initially to start bringing in scientists and engineers and thinkers to start thinking about these things now so we could start to prepare for the future and get left a bang. And so initially, if you look at that program at the time, really brought in scientists and engineers from NASA Langley Research Center, from a lot of the different national labs, even other parts of the government like FBI. So really bringing in these different minds. And if you go back, actually looked at the reporting back from those times, they were pretty spot on actually for what we're seeing in the 2020s and beyond. And however, the problem is that it was extremely self-contained. All of it was classified. There was closed groups that did this, and so I don't think it ever really permeated with kind of senior leadership and helped us change our thinking. And we were pretty mired in the counterinsurgency and counterterrorism fight at that time. And so, as we saw the drawdowns in the 2010s in Iraq and Afghanistan, the program kind of shuttered from there. And then in 2015, our G2 at the time, Tom Greco, who just retired a couple months ago, was looking at what was happening in Syria in terms of hybrid and irregular warfare, what was happening in Ukraine at the time, Eastern Ukraine, Donbass, and Crimea, as well as kind of a Chinese revolution in military affairs, and really said, okay, there's a changing character of warfare here. And how can we start to think differently about the future and not get ourselves once again locked in on this glide path? And so he stood the Army Mad Scientists Initiative back up, but really in a much different profile where we were much more forward facing. So really about 75 or more % of what we do is completely unclassified, distribution A, and it really allows us to think differently by engaging with people that the Army normally doesn't talk to. And so that's where we kind of got into this idea of harnessing the intellect of the nation. And so when we did that, we wanted to start engaging with different communities. And there's really kind of three, and you talked about it early on the intro, but there's really three communities that we engage with primarily to help us do that. And so the first is really other government agencies and other branches of the DoD, as well as our allies and partners. So we, of course, have great relationships with sister services as we think about these things. I'll actually be heading out this week over to talk to the Marine Corps about how we view the operational environment out to 2033. So really working with those DoD partners, which is what we want to do and continue to be joint. But we also have a very strong relationship with the intelligence community. So previously, pre-COVID, we usually had about 3 conferences a year, 2 of those being unclassified, 1 being classified. And previous partners have been the National Intelligence Council, the Office for the Director of National Intelligence, National Ground Intelligence Center, and NASA Langley Research Center as well. And what we do is bring in members throughout the intelligence community so that as we engage with those other communities that I'll talk about in a minute, we diverge on our learning and then come back to converge and really kind of vet and check that against more concrete intelligence. So we have great relationships with them. Additionally, working with our allies and partners. Previously, I've worked a lot with NATO ACT and the NATO Innovation Hub over in Norfolk. But additionally, we actually had in 2019, or actually, I'm sorry, very early 2020, we looked at global perspectives of the operational environment to understand how our allies and partners viewed the OE in the future, as opposed to just our US-centric version, which will really allowed us to challenge a lot of assumptions about how we think and prioritize on those things. So that's one aspect. And again, also not just the DoD, not just the intel community, not just our allies and partners, other parts of the government as well. So we've had some work we've done on weaponization of information with Department of State, Department of Treasury. We have a great relationship with DHS and the U.S. Secret Service. So really understanding how everybody across that national security and defense ecosystem thinks about those things. And then the second community is academia. So when we have those conferences, we've typically partnered with the academic institution. We've had a long-running relationship with the Georgetown University Security Studies Institute. Additionally, we worked with GTRI, SRI International, Arizona State University, and of course, West Point as well. So those academic institutions are a real help to us because they're researching not necessarily for research sake, but they don't have the same kind of profit model or focus that you'll see in the private sector or in the DoD. So academia, including the think tanks like RAND, Center for Naval Analyses, CNA, New America, Center for New American Security. We kind of work across the spectrum because there's a lot of great minds out there to try and help harness us and think about these areas. And then the third is really that tech and industry sector. Now, we typically don't work a lot with the major defense firms, the Lockheeds and the Booz Allens, although we have worked with them in the past because they have a different model how they look at things. Their cycle tends to be a little shorter in and maybe iterative. But we have worked with some major tech firms like IBM, Google, have had a great relationship in the past with NVIDIA as well. So really working with those big tech firms, but the smaller startups actually are the ones that provide a lot of value to us in terms of relationships because they're a lot of times looking at the bleeding edge of technology and not into maybe what's being widely adopted, but those bleeding edge technologies can really help give us weak signals for the future to start thinking about what might be out there. So those are the three communities that we work with. And we kind of envision, or as we say, vision the future through four different ways. One, which is really a huge one for mad scientists, is storytelling. So there's really two sides of that coin. We bring in a lot of storytellers. So we previously had August Cole and Pete Singer, authors of Ghost Fleet and Burn-In, actually have their own organization, Fictional Intelligence, or FICINT, and looks at useful intelligence and how we do use storytelling for that. And we've also had in previously David Brin, another sci-fi author, actually had Ronald D. Moore, who is the showrunner for the reimagined Battlestar Galactica and is currently working on For All Mankind. So we try to bring in these storytellers. And additionally, we try to use storytelling to help describe the operational environment because we don't want to predict the operational environment because point prediction is really a sucker's bet. We can't sit there and say in 2033, this exact technology will come to fruition and will be widely scaled at this. But what we can do is try to describe the operational environment. What is it going to look like? What are the characteristics? What do we see featured in that? And that helps drive requirements and how we think about what we need to do to future ready the force. And storytelling is a huge part of that. We've had previously science fiction writing contests that have taken, again, harnessed not only the intellect of the nation, but actually the globe, because out of our four finalists for the last contest that we had, one was a school teacher from Australia, one was a businessman from England. So it was really bringing in people who might not even have anything to do with the DoD and thinking about that differently. And storytelling, instead of throwing a lot of research and white papers at senior leaders and really the wider DoD ecosystem, but also the general public, as we kind of talked about earlier, that allows us to put them in there. It contextualizes it in a way that standard kind of research and those point papers can't really do. And so storytelling is incredibly powerful to be able to do that. And the second that we do, and I already kind of covered it a little bit, is this idea of crowdsourcing and really kind of bringing in different minds and ideas as we think about these things. And if they're not affiliated with DoD or national security, even better, because they're going to have differing perspectives. And so some of those crowdsourcing events will be more formal kind of writing contests or longer form. Sometimes we've done Twitter contests where we want to see, in whatever the character limit, 250 or whatever it is now, what can you tell us about the future character of warfare in that time? What are some uses for autonomy outside of lethal autonomy and things like that? And we've gotten some really brilliant ideas. And you don't use crowdsourcing for decision making or policy or anything like that, but it does allow you to challenge your assumptions. Like Dr. Jamie Canton, who's been a big part of Mad Scientists, has always said, we want to disrupt ourselves before we're disrupted. And so crowdsourcing helps us to challenge those assumptions. And then the third is really historical analogies. And we actually had this past year, or I should say in 2022, we were at the National Museum of the U.S. Army, and we had a conference, Back to the Future Using History to Forecast. And through that conference, what we wanted to do was, how does history shape our thinking and our decision making and our biases? And using that is really important because we tend to think about a lot of the problems and challenges we face today as extremely unique or novel. This is a 2023 problem. This has never been dealt with before. And in some sense, in some of the technologies and the disruption from those, yes, that's true in some ways. But if you look at those challenges and kind of the overall archetype of them, we've been through this before. It depends on where and what the technology was, or not even just technology, just political, economic, societal trends. And so using history doesn't mean we use historical analogies as a one-for-one. What's our next Maginot Line? What is the next World War II type conflict? That doesn't really help us much. But what it can do is help frame our thinking. And really,
history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
But it rhymes, exactly. Yeah. And it can be instructive of how we think about these things. And so the one example we like to use a lot, Harvard Business Review actually had a really good article about using science fiction to think about the future. And one of the examples that they gave was in the early 1900s, as the US was industrializing and we saw kind of this urbanization happening across the country. One of the issues was horse manure. So as you started to bring more people into cities, you needed more transportation and everything for logistics. And so you had to have more horses. And there was this horse manure just piling up in the streets. It was a hygiene problem. It was an aesthetics problem. And they wanted to get after it. So the nation's first kind of city planners and urban planners and city managers came together in this conference, and they wanted to tackle this problem. And they came up with nothing, at least no major panacea, no great solution. And so they did that, and there was nothing. But then you look fast forward 10 years, and it doesn't matter. As you have cars taking over the roadway, that's not the problem anymore. You have a much different problem when it comes to traffic and management of all these things throughout the city. So the question we have to ask ourselves then, as we think about challenges conventionally, are we asking the right questions? So if you ask now a senior military leader about, say, if we did have to go to Europe to go fight tomorrow, the question might be, how do we move all this armor and personnel? How do we get it across in this tyranny of distance? Across the Atlantic or Mediterranean. And is that the right question, though? Are we really looking at this challenge in the right way? And so you start to challenge your own thinking on those things. So that's where historical analogies come into play. And then finally, we like to look, as I talked about with the startups, really at edge cases. And edge cases are really important because it's not always going to tell you, it's not predictive of the future just because you have something on that bleeding edge. But again, it can let you start to think about what kind of impact that will have on the operational environment. An example I like to use is in 2018, when we were at SRI International, we were doing a conference on bioconvergence and the idea of these different biotechnologies and how they were converging with our society, how we structure our force, how we train our soldiers, all these things. And one of the topics that was discussed there was gene editing, like CRISPR, and looking at this. And it was really something we, were forecasting or horizon scanning, thinking about it really in kind of the 2030 timeframe and beyond. And then within a couple months of that conference, we saw the first gene edited twin babies out of China. And that was an extreme wake up about how quickly this technology was potentially coming. And so it was extremely important for us to look at those edge cases and think about it. And some of the edge cases that we saw, even in, it was, assessed insurgents or extremists using saturation attacks for UAS against a Russian naval base in the Black Sea, and as well as another event of the Houthi rebels attacking the Saudi oil fields with UAS. And those were early indicators, and we're seeing it manifest right now in Russia-Ukraine fight about how important and proliferated UAS were going to be on that future battlefield. And so looking at edge cases can help us do that. So the program, as you know, having been on the Convergence podcast, so we have the podcast where we try to feature a lot of different guests. Although we've had senior military leaders, it's not just let's get the most senior person on. We want to get folks with differing ideas like yourself. We've had folks from across industry come on and talk the metaverse, additive manufacturing. Recently, we've done a deeper dive into Chat GPT and generative AI. So we want to use that as a platform to give people a chance to talk about maybe issues that they don't get to talk about in other venues or mediums. And then we have the Mad Scientist Laboratory, which is our blog, where we usually post about once or twice a week, quick reads about the future. So between the podcast, the blog, all of our previous unclassified conferences have been live streamed and recorded. And we actually have all those previous unclassified ones on our YouTube page. So available for folks to be able to go and check that out. Additionally, on the All Partners Access Network, we posted all of our content in terms of our foundational stuff that we've contributed to, like the operational environment, and looking at the future documents like that, the changing character of warfare, but additionally from outputs that we've had from post-conference reports to the crowdsourcing that I spoke about before. All that stuff's widely available because it's really important for us to share all these things and get the information out there, because that's what gives us an advantage. That's what gives us power, is our people are our power. So how can we inform them best, and how can we help them think about the future?
Wow. Yeah. So many things to potentially follow up on there. A couple things jumped out at me. One, you were talking about that problem with horse manure in the streets, and the problem. Me paraphrasing here, but it seems like the problem resolved itself due to follow-on innovation. And there's a principle, and I'll have to look it up and try to put it in the show notes. I'm not going to nail it right now, but there's some kind of a management principle that basically says it is to an organization's interest, not to try to solve everything, because some problems just wind up resolving themselves in ways that don't require some sort of a 5-point plan. It's like 9 out of 10 problems will just kind of go away on their own because of other forces at work. And so perhaps part of the role of innovation, or future casting, or I'm sure these kinds of projects that you and your colleagues are working on, Luke, would be to in some way through a logical technique to identify those problems that are likely not to go away on their own. I'm curious if the kinds of scenario planning that you guys have done have identified stuff like that. Do you kind of get what I'm asking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really comes back to something that we try to stress a lot, which is the idea of first principles thinking, because we can really, especially the DoD, right? We're a huge behemoth of an organization, and it can be really easy to get on this linear path of thinking and firefighting and putting out fires for what we perceive as current pressing problems, and let's solve this, but we're missing the forest for the trees, and we're not seeing what are those enduring, persistent and wicked problems that have to be tackled, as opposed to what's a 50-meter target right in front of us. And so first principle thinking is instead of saying, how do we get, let's say, how do we get all this armor over? How do we get, how do we get, these systems to this area? How do we get even enough munitions and things like that? What are the effects we're trying to achieve? Is it mass? Is it precision strike? Is it, overall getting more philosophical into undermining and eroding the will of the adversary? Is it winning in competition? What is the end state that we're trying to achieve? And then you can work from there instead of going on the same iterative path where we think, okay, here's our plan. Here's how we think about concepts. Let's just keep iterating on it to try and improve it. And that doesn't mean you always throw the baby out with the bathwater, but you have to look at, is this going after the first principles that we're trying to achieve here, if that makes sense?
It does. Yeah, 100%. You mentioned the podcast that you co-host, The Convergence. Could you tell the audience a little bit more about this podcast? Why is it called The Convergence, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. Because we started it initially when Mad Scientist was reimagined in 2015. We still have a great relationship with Modern Warfare Institute at West Point. John Amble, who was, I believe, is still actually the managing editor over there. John would, for the MWI podcast, would do special episodes for us when we had events. And we saw the value that brought and thought, man, we need to really get on this and be able to have our own medium to be able to host all the, there was just never enough space to get in all these disruptive thinkers who were going to talk about, really some edge ideas as we thought about it. And even now, it's hard to fit in even the amount of great ideas that are out there to try and fit in. But we wanted to stand that up. And the convergence is there because convergence is all about the convergence of a bunch of different trends and technologies coming together and forming something very different. And that's what's really important as we think about how our world is shaped. Because operational environment isn't just, okay, what's the security threat? We have assessments that do that. We have even down to the national security strategy and other such documents that look at those kind of things. So what's a point of the operational environment? It's actually the whole across when you think about PMISI or DIME or those kinds of scopes as we think about them. It's more than just even the technology. There are political, economic, societal, informational, as we think about the Informational Professionals Association. These are all trends that come together. And I always, use the example of what I have in my hand right now, an iPhone or really a smartphone is the perfect example of convergence because these technologies existed separately. It was the convergence of these technologies that really changed our everyday lives. The idea of digital cameras were already emerging. The miniaturization of computer technology and processing, screen technology was changing. The ability to communicate, to use the internet in new ways other than logging on to the internet, which are, any folks listening from Gen Z and younger really won't know that perspective of logging on and getting on the web. It's become pervasive because all those things came together. Again, it was the technologies that came together. It was also societally how we were changing, forming online communities, how we communicated with each other. It was very, very different. And so we look at the convergence of those things. And so we see right now different technologies that are emerging, right? We see augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed reality. We're seeing generative AI to more decision-driven or specific AI, over to potential for quantum information sciences. And we're seeing societal changes, right? The pandemic was a big impact on that as well. But how we talk to each other, what our structures are for families, society, community, all these things are changing. And so what are the convergences that are going to take place to change the threat profile, but also just dynamically change the operational environment. So that's where the convergence came from. And we really wanted to feature, again, a wide variety of people that have come on. We've had students, we've had senior military leaders, but we've also had tech leaders. We had a baseball writer, Keith Law, that came.
Is that right?
We could talk about, different ideas behind cognitive biases and our mental processes for decision making. So we've had a lot of different folks, and we want to be that venue to start thinking about it. And a lot of times it's not, the conversation doesn't end there. It's the starter for the conversation, for the follow-on work that'll take place for how we approach innovation.
Yeah, that's awesome. I can almost hear a audience member thinking and asking the question. So if someone likes what they're hearing here and they want to get involved with the kinds of things that you guys are working on, Luke, what's the best way for someone to get involved?
Yeah, so I highly encourage folks to, again, listen to the podcast. Make sure you subscribe. I'll always throw out there, give us
Yep.
subscribe, and make sure you give us a review. But also, when it comes to the Mad Scientist Laboratory, our blog, highly encourage folks to subscribe to that. But also, over 50% of our submissions on there are publishing is guest submissions, because again, we want to be that medium. If you have an idea about the future, it doesn't have to be military related. If there are things that you're seeing that you want to write about, it doesn't have to be a long form white paper. We want to be that medium. We want to be that conversation starter. So please come to us. There's contact. You can always contact us at madscitradoc@gmail.com. There is a lot of opportunity for folks to get involved. As I said before, we've had crowdsourcing events. We're looking at potential writing contests for this summer. So really want to get people involved. We always say we're a community of action, not a community of interest or just practice, a community of action. And that involves bringing people in who can make a difference and really get that in front of other people.
Yeah, kindred spirits. It sounds a lot like the Information Professionals Association as well. Community of action, fomenting and developing solutions that help keep the lights on this great American and Western experiment. How about we do a quick lightning round, Luke, and then we will close out. So lightning round, I don't know, 30 seconds to 1 minute per item, something along those lines. Okay, so first, publicly available information and open source intelligence, or PAI and OSINT.
Incredibly important, changing the paradigm of how we think about intelligence. There's still going to be a need for secure intelligence as we think about exquisite capabilities in imagery, signals intelligence, and everything else. But we're seeing right now with the war, with the fight that's taking place in the information sphere, publicly available information in OSINT is extremely powerful, and we're going to need it if we want to gain information advantage and win in competition, even if it's that fleeting superiority in the information space. So it's actually perfect today talking to you when we talk about the Information Professionals Association. We had on Duan Lee, who's the founder for Vast OSINT, was previously at Signal Labs and the Naval Postgraduate School. Duan is a fantastic contributor to Mad Scientist. And I've had just personally a ton of discussions with him about information warfare and how we think about it. And a lot of times information warfare or the information environment gets categorized as irregular warfare. And we would both probably argue it is not. It's actually regular. It is happening more frequently than kinetic warfare, even with what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. The information fight is happening every single day. And so OSINT and PAI is incredibly important to that. Now, the question is, how do we balance that with security, with protection of that, our own information, and how do we use that in a way that still is in line with our values, our American values and morals, and ethics as well.
Yeah, 100%. And Duan Lee, a friend of the show, we had him on the podcast way back at the beginning, and also August Cole. You mentioned him as well. We'll have
A
links
little bit.
to those both of those episodes. Second lightning round: sensors.
Sensors are everywhere. We're looking at by 2030, 2035, you're looking at around 1 trillion nano sensors and emitters around the world. Sensing is taking again we're seeing democratization across these technologies where we typically thought of sensors as our capital systems. We think about our traditional or conventional space sensing capabilities as we thought about sensing capabilities throughout the DoD, although we lost some of that edge when we were in the coin CT fight and not going up against conventional, but we're having to recognize how are we using sensing in a way that is ubiquitous and more proliferated. And there's plenty of sensing out there. I actually did a talk with Defense Entrepreneurs Forum in Boston, and we talked about and another group of intelligence professionals where we talked about intelligent eyes and ears everywhere, and they're becoming intelligent in the sense that it's being connected through this Internet of Things and eventually kind of an Internet of Everything. The sensing is going to be there everywhere. Everywhere we look, there's not too many places you can go right now that are not under some level of sensing. The question is, how do you make sense of that sensing? How do you process it? And there's really not probably enough people power, enough manpower, so to speak, to get that done. So how are you going to use AI, machine learning, automation to be able to process and exploit that and go through all the, when we talk dull, dirty, dangerous, at least all the dull parts of that, and then get the humans to do the critical thinking and the contextualization that they do best.
Yeah, great perspective. Last lightning round. I heard this on another podcast. Somebody just kind of in an offhand fashion, they used the term personal brand. And I just wanted to get your take on the concept of a personal brand.
Yeah, I do think I think personal brands are important, although someone like myself who is probably on LinkedIn too much sometimes. I'm not a big user of other social media platforms, but across those you'll see influencers who try to develop their personal brand. But I think personal brand is important in the sense that it tells about who you are and how folks can engage with you. And I think just from my perspective, personal branding is important to connect to whatever mission you're trying to support. So if I had a personal brand that had to do with, I don't know, music and photography, that doesn't necessarily connect as well with what I'm thinking about for the future operational environment and how we connect to that kind of divergent thinking. But maybe it does. Maybe it's more cowbell as we think about, the fever for that. But how do you relate to that stuff? And I think personal brand then has to be not just how do I typically write? Do I have a certain voice? Is there certain things that I do? It's about people being able to recognize with you, not recognize you in the notoriety sense, but rather recognize with you and relate to that personal brand that then brings them in. And I've seen criticism on LinkedIn where you usually see LinkedIn is not Facebook and let's keep it purely professional, which is kind of funny because if you think about it at work, can you imagine if you're in an office building and you talk to people and literally the only thing you talk about is that work? I mean, we hear water cooler conversations every day, right? Ranging from football to hopefully not always, but politics to popular culture to all these different things. And that's how we connect to each other. That's how we develop a lot of these relationships. It's not purely this is only the professional stuff that we will discuss. So I think that personal branding allows people to connect to you and then thereby connect to the mission as well. It allows that more personal connection. So that's kind of how I view it.
Yeah, and to LinkedIn, until recently, Luke, you had what I thought was a really cool LinkedIn image where it was like a cartoonized version of you. Uh, it seemed to me like you were in a spacesuit or something like that.
Yeah,
But
yeah, that
but
was
but
I actually used a application, Lens AI, and it generated, basically you took a couple headshots of yourself, selfies, and then it generated all these. Some of them, I actually I'll have to send you some of the other ones, but some of them were pretty close, and some of them were way off. And it was actually an interesting experiment, kind of in generative AI and how we see ourselves. And I did it because I thought it was interesting to have this kind of digital avatar that was in space, in some kind of astronaut suit. So I think those things are interesting, and I like to, in my personal branding, I try to keep things interesting, and I could just have a headshot of myself in a suit on there, and keep it like that. But I think it's interesting to keep it unique and try and cause people to think. And that actually, that headshot, or that profile picture on LinkedIn, generated a lot of conversation with people, and led to even me kind of diving into thinking about generative AI, and what that means to us for identity, for how we communicate. And I just think all that stuff is really interesting.
Yeah, 100%. Okay, wrapping up here. So those listeners of the Convergence will recognize this question, but one of the things that you and your co-host Matt ask guests is what their favorite movie is. So I wanted to flip that around on you. What is your favorite movie and why?
We always say this is probably our most challenging question, and I'm gonna cheat on this question, as some people have done. I'll just kind of give you my top three, just because
Oh, okay,
that's
all right.
that's
Uh-huh.
my cop out usually. I think the one I usually go to most, is, and most people consider it more like a Christmas movie, but It's a Wonderful Life is really a big one to me, because I think it shows what a difference one person can make in so many other people's lives. And it's just really when I need a positive story about, relating to community, to being resilient, to caring about other people. I think it's such a great classic movie, and just timeless. The second one I always say is Godfather. I just love the original Godfather. I just can't describe the cinematic masterpiece that is. So much great acting, and just a great movie. And then the third, and I'll put on kind of my sci-fi hat here. To me, is Interstellar. I just love that movie, and really made me think a lot about how we think about dimensions, like physics when it comes to gravity as a fourth dimension, or maybe time as a fourth dimension. Just a fantastic movie. Love Interstellar.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. So we've got a lot of students and researchers who listen to this podcast. Could you offer a fruitful research question, or something that an interested student might explore further along these lines?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll use a little bit of presentism, because typically a lot of questions are about AI, and I kind of, and this is my personal take, but I do think
Yeah.
generative AI, when we talk about Chat GPT and things like that, and I've been doing a lot of diving into that right now. I think it's a little almost overhyped, and we see it as fundamentally changing work and division of labor, and our society and things like that. And I think there are some aspects to it, but I think we're getting a little putting the cart a little bit ahead of the horse here. What really a research question that I think about is, what are the dynamics and different characteristics, and really just the impacts on our society that we might see from brain computer interfaces in the near future. And that's, we just saw FDA approval for Neuralink and another BCI tech company to start doing testing on humans. And frankly, that scares me a lot, because that is a direct link to your brain, your neural pathways, how you think, how you execute. There's a lot of promise there when it comes to potential for people with neurological disorders, Parkinson's, things like that. There's a lot of positives and potential gains in those areas. There's a lot of surface area for nefarious activity too,
Yep.
and how can those be hacked? What do we think about security for that? And this isn't information appearing on a screen that we engage with. This isn't even immersive kind of, virtual reality. This is literally in our brains. So I think we need to be extremely cautious as we go forward. And it actually, to me, presents more of a existential threat to us than potentially even things that get talked about right now, like general artificial intelligence or super intelligence. It's probably quite a ways away, if not, might never occur, or even the what's being produced with generative AI. These are all important considerations, but BCI is something that's going to impact us in untold ways. And so I think the research question is how could that manifest in the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, excellent question. Finally, a book that you could recommend to the audience.
Oh, this is tough because I think, John, I'm a huge reader. And I generally try to get through about 75 books a year.
Wow. Okay.
I'll cheat this one again, just real quick. There's two that I consistently recommend. Ozan Varol has a great book called Think Like a Rocket Scientist. And it's really fantastic. Looks at NASA, and looks at some of the successes. Obviously, a lot there, but also a lot of the failures between Challenger and Columbia, and different things that have not gone so well. And how do you deconstruct your thinking to attack these without getting linear, and getting into kind of the status quo? And so I use a lot of the thinking strategies in that, things like what they call pre-mortem. So instead of failure happens or a catastrophe or death, and we do a post-mortem, what's a pre-mortem? If this were to fail, how did that happen? How would it happen? And that allows you to backwards plan from there and think about the potential for catastrophe within that. So I highly recommend that book usually. And again, that's my personal recommendation. Also, really, really love Rush Doshi, who's the China SME right now, President Biden's National Security Council. But when he was at, I believe, Brookings, wrote a book called The Long Game. And it's really about China's long game strategic plan and really process for how they have tried to and will continue to try to displace the U.S. in the global world order, to reorder things with China as the premier power. And for the threat we're facing right now, I just cannot recommend that book enough.
All right. Excellent suggestions. And with that, we wish you, Luke, and your colleagues there at the Army Mad Scientist Initiative Godspeed as you continue engaging with this very important problem set. And with that, Luke Shabro, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks. Appreciate it, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.